extraterrestrial explanation. And I based that on 25 years of my own study and research. But I could be wrong, and I'm ready to be shown to be wrong or whatever. So far, the evidence I don't find is very good for extraterrestrials. That's what was my normal first belief of what UFOs were about, that they were alien spacecraft. I've come not to think that. If there is the ETH and if there are Earthlights, there will be this immediate reaction, especially from the ETH people, who will say, oh, well, okay, there you are. UFOs, that's what we're really interested in. We're not interested in these balls of electricity. I've tried very, very briefly to indicate that these things are not just balls of electricity. They are an exotic phenomenon that we have failed to comprehend. So they are important per se. Secondly, they are undoubtedly important in ufology because most reports of UFOs are light. And if these things are occurring, they must comprise a large proportion of what are reported as UFOs. In fact, I'd go so far to say that if there are extraterrestrial craft and Earthlights, the Earthlights are the greater part of what true unexplained phenomena is reported. But whatever, they're a vital part of the whole pattern. Also, we must remember that the term UFO does not mean alien spacecraft. It means unidentified flying object, and we've not identified it, whoever we are, from whatever angles. It may be that the terrain relatedness of Earthlight, if they perhaps are some form of extraterrestrial or interdimensional life, the terrain connection is something that the ETH people ought to be looking at a damn sight closer than they are, but they're too busy looking up there. What about looking down here? Maybe there's an energy phenomenon on Earth that extraterrestrials can use to manifest. It's a thought. I don't think it for a minute, but it could be. Let's at least ask a few questions. There's also a third phenomenon that occurs, and it's nothing to do with Earthlight, and it's nothing to do with extraterrestrials. I've seen it once myself when I was about 9, around about 1954, and I was coming up from my school in my home village of Thurmaston in Leicestershire, going up this hillside with a colleague, little colleague from school, and we suddenly saw this great black dirigible airship over a place called Humberston. And all details, the gondola, the ribbing, everything was there. It's a great black airship. I said, ooh, look at that. It was gone. We reached the top of the hill, we could see half of Leicestershire. There was no sign of it. But there was something there. That was a real phantom in the sky. Years and years later, to come back to where I came in, when we started our study of Leicestershire, I found in the UFO data 3 cases of cigar-shaped UFOs being seen over Humberston over the years, over that 25-year period. And I thought, cigar-shaped, airship. Was some repeating image going on there? There are ghosts on Earth. The planet is haunted, I'm quite sure of that. And that, I'm sure, is another phenomenon that stands over yet again from Earthlights or extraterrestrial craft. We don't know this planet we live on as much as we would like to think. If you're going to push the extraterrestrial hypothesis, it is at least important to understand the history of that, to know where and how it arose, how recent it is, and how it's only one of at least a dozen other explanations, some of which have lasted much longer than the ETH. The ETH may be correct, but it is only one possible explanation, and to not know what the others were and how this one arose and how so in coincidence with our society it happens to be is, in my view, a culpable omission. It's not being square about it. Then what about daylight discs? Well, they're these black shapes. Plasma do look like metals, in daylight, and I can take, if I bother to set up the equipment, a photograph of a ball bearing and a photograph of thin air underwater, a bubble, and they would look identical. They both would look metallic. Different interfacing media can have a surface that has a sheen, a mechanical, metallic-looking sheen. And they're very rare, of course. Abductions, well, the abduction thing is a whole area I can't go into, won't go into, other than to say that I think there are other, without denying the reality of these experiences to people, but Jenny has touched on it, and in a way, in a curious way, so did Bud. But he was working out of another framework, I feel. But there are other ways of understanding abductions. I'm going to tell you this as just a piece of information I can't go into. But not a million miles from Sheffield, there is university-level work going on in which the little greys have actually been encountered. If you like, and I put it in a sensationalist Sunday sport manner, little greys helping researchers at British University. And what's happening? It's happening in the context of consciousness studies work that's going on. And little dwarfish grey creatures that prod and poke at the human body have been encountered. And they ain't from outer space, I can tell you that much. And unless one is aware of the work of Groff, of Hearn, Labarge, Metzler, and a whole gallery of other people, we cannot even begin to assess what abductions and extraterrestrial close encounters could be about. Unless we know this work, highly relevant, the most relevant work going on, more relevant, I would venture to say, than anything going on within ufology, that work must be understood and placed in the context of abductions. We don't understand consciousness very well at all. And I would say, as the final thing, that it's my guess that the alien presence we are really dealing with is the human mind itself. We have nature, we have mind, and the truly tiny percentage though it is, the tiny percentage of truly unexplained phenomena that is.
Is there any relationship between the mineralogy of a particular sort of mineral and the colour of light?
Fascinating question, and the answer is I don't know. But there is a hint that there may be a mineralogical connection with the light colour. But there just hasn't been the depth and richness of research that's gone on to say yes or no. So I don't know, but it's a very interesting question we ask ourselves too.
Once again, Paul, thank you very much. We're having a short break now for 15 minutes. Our next speaker will be one of my colleagues, John Spencer, and we will round the evening off with our colleague from America, Mr. Hopkins. Thank you. Two things I'd like to say before we start with our next speaker is the first raffle prize is still yet to be claimed. It's number 68. And if anyone's got the winning ticket, see my colleague Robin at the front. And we still have copies of the UFO news file on sale in the play for a pound. It's excellent value. There's all the latest information from the newspapers about the circles and so on from all over the country. And I guess it's still available in the foyer. Our next presentation is from a colleague of mine who is originally popped up from the United States. He's recently been speaking at the UFO Symposium at the Pensacola Hilton in Florida. One of the most controversial cases to, pardon the pun, crop up for a number of years is the Gulf Breeze UFO photographs stroke sightings, again that took place in Florida. Now, the basic scenario, without going into too many details, a chap by the name of Edward Walters and his wife have taken some 30 plus photographs over a number of months. Some of you may have seen the book of the sightings available in the foyer. UFO photographs in themselves are quite controversial. To have 30 plus is unheard of. Recently, rumours have been filtering through from the United States about hoaxes and models and a whole host of things. And one of the things that John attempted to do while he was in the States was clarify a few things for us and clear up these rumours. John, in his own right, is co-editor of BUFORA's publication Phenomenon, which some of you may have read, and also UFOs 1947 to 1987. Since then, he has also authored his own book on abduction called Perspectives, and it's about the first time I haven't given a plug for it. I don't think we have any copies here today. He's also the chairman of the British UFO Research Association, vice chairman, I get it right, I usually call him vice president, but but he's the Vice Chairman of the British UFO Research Association. I'd like to give you a warm welcome to John Spencer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Phil said, less than 48 hours before arriving here in Sheffield for this conference, I was in America, in Gulf Breeze, at the tail end of a trip that had included the Pensacola Conference and the study of the Gulf Breeze area. And the only thing I did, by the way, between arriving home and getting up here was to collect a message from Phil saying that I had volunteered to give a presentation. As Phil said, this was, of course, because I was an absolutely wonderful speaker, and by the way, the Russians had pulled out and no one else would come in. So I did a Mike Wootton. I said, well, no problem, I'll just quickly adapt the talk I gave in Pensacola and deliver that. But when I got to Sheffield yesterday morning, I'd not even got my hands on a sausage and egg McMuffin breakfast before I was being grilled on Gulf Breeze. I suppose I'm probably the only British ufologist that's been over there to look at the case to the degree that I have. But I do want to be clear from the start that I'm no expert on Gulf Breeze, nor was I trying to reinvestigate the case. To the extent that I was interested in the case, I sort of merely absorbed some impressions about it, some probably surprising, and I'll share those with you. I won't be confusing you with too many facts, because obviously the facts are very convoluted. The case itself, as presented in America, took about 4 hours. And if this presentation seems a bit of a shambles, well, that's really only because it is. However, remember the words of Benjamin Franklin: at 20 years of age, the will reigns, at 30 the wit, and at 40 the judgment. Well, I'm 36, and I'd probably be quite witty if I wasn't so totally jet-lagged, but I've got 4 years before I have to exercise judgment, so I'm going to take the privilege of sitting on the fence a bit here. This is really a story about the way Americans do ufology, and a lot about the American point of view and their treatment of the subject, not just Gulf Breeze. So we'll be looking quite a lot at that. And for those of you who haven't had jet lag, I can tell you it feels a bit like DTs and salmonella poisoning and tiredness. So if you all fall asleep, I will understand, and please, if I fall asleep, wake me up. Let me tell you what I did manage to achieve during the 5 days I was there, 2 of which were the conference proper. One was a closed door meeting head-to-head with 21 other ufologists, and the other 2 days were available for Gulf Breeze. That's the only 2 days I was able to get. MUFON, I must say, laid things on for me with incredible warmth and generosity. From the moment that I landed at Pensacola, I was picked up by one of the Gulf Breeze principal investigators, Gary Watson, and he volunteered to take me anywhere I wanted to go, see anything, anybody, anytime. And without that, of course, I would never have been able to do all that I wanted to do. There was a bit of a funny story behind that, and it's relevant to the differences between American and British ufology. I suppose it's something to recall. One of the Congress organisers there had decided that because I had publicly stated in print that I didn't necessarily support the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that I regarded regression hypnosis as a very flawed research tool, not therapeutic tool, but research tool. That I'd warned Walt Andrus, that MUFON International, the MUFON International director, to be careful of Ed because he could be a dangerous character if you put all the sort of support behind him. Because of all this, they thought I might be a closet debunker, out to wreck the conference, although Walt did tell them I wasn't. So Gary very openly admitted from the very beginning that he had been assigned to check me out and stay with me and make sure that I wasn't one of these characters. And we got on okay, there was no problem. In England, I was warned when you go to America, you'd be well advised to take a flak jacket with you. And when Bud Hopkins gets hold of you, he'll shake you warmly by the throat. Well, Bud Hopkins got hold of me and shook me warmly by the hand, and the two of us and a scotch bottle had a great time behind the bar. And American ufology, different as it is, was quite accepting a lot of our stuff we're talking about here today. I might say, by the way, that the same Congress organiser took me aside after the speech, clapped his arms around me, and in a very surprised voice said, "You're not that bad after all." So I suppose I passed the audition. What I did was this then. I spent around an hour interviewing Don Ware and Charles Flanagan, who are 2 of the principal 3 investigators, and I must have had about 6 hours of interrogative questioning, I think, with Gary Watson. Now, that's the 3 main team. A whole load of other people have been drafted in. There are a lot of witnesses to Gulf Breeze. Of the rest of the investigators have been drafted in. I spoke to 3 others. There was Walt Andrus, who's personally investigating the case as well. There was Vicky Lyons, who is one of the was one of the Congress organisers, and I'm afraid there was a third one who I've tried all night to remember the name, but I can't remember. This is probably a good place to add that since I had no idea that I was going to be talking on this, I brought none of my notes with me from when I was there, and so I'm relying only on what I've been able to put together since I got up here. And considering this is a photographic case, I ought to have a lot of slides, and I haven't. The few I've got I've been cobbling together from other speakers who happen to have bits and pieces, so I'll use those a bit. What I have got myself, I was able to reshoot all of the sort of Ed Walters shots in the daytime from more or less the same location. Ed's moved house now, so we couldn't very well go and invade somebody else's house, but we did that. I was able to take a lot of other ancillary shots as well, but I'm afraid they're still in my suitcase. I didn't even make it to Boots yet. I took the Greyhound bus tour of all the locations with 260 other people, by the way. It was actually a Greyhound bus convoy. But Gary Watson and I spent the best part of one whole day just running up and down the Gulf Breeze Peninsula on my questioning, sort of saying, show me this, show me that, and he would run around showing me these things, giving me a very detailed one-to-one talk on all the sites. As if to prove, I suppose, that I was some kind of crazy Englishman, I might add that I went in for some rather pointless checks that I thought could be useful and weren't. I parked where Ed parked during the famous road shot, and just for pure authenticity climbed underneath Gary Watson's car to see if that sort of gave me some perspective, and it just made me rather dirty. I laid on the beach where Ed Walters was found after he'd been abducted with a 1.25 hour time lapse, and got dirty again. I scraped my fingernails on every rock, plant and dustbin near the beach to try and find the substance that got under Ed's fingernails during the abduction, and I got quite dirty again and quite smelly, but not in the way that Ed did, so that didn't help. I did some checking for local chemical plants or any dumps into the water from any of the ships around, and I couldn't find anything there. So, I mean, I'm not saying that matters a great deal, but I didn't find anything positive to offer. On instructions from some researchers that I'd spoken to in Sweden just before I went over, I doused the circle of the so-called landing site. The dousing reaction was very positive. Unfortunately, I don't know what that means because I'm not an expert on dousing. I recorded the circle using a dictaphone, which they asked me to do, and to me it proves nothing. I can't hear a thing, but the tape's going over to them, so we'll see what they say. Can't think if I made another fool of myself. I probably did, but I can't remember when. I also got an exclusive 1.5 hours with Ed and some time with his wife Frances, and I managed to slip my leash and get behind the cook's tour and found some of these other 200 plus witnesses without being directed to them, which I thought was useful. Now remember, this is just 2 days, so there's nowhere near enough that I can investigate this, or put it sceptically, there's no way I was going to catch anybody out, so all you're getting from me is just a few impressions. Just before that, I'll do a quick resume of the case for those not familiar with it, and it will be quick because, as I say, the slides aren't there. Can I have the lights down? This is a typical Gulf Breeze photograph. I think this one is one of Ed's. You can see that the flying saucer, I mean, we're not talking here about an out-of-focus pigeon flying past, or we're not talking about an illusion of the planet Jupiter. This is either the real thing or a total fake. There's no question about that, I wouldn't think. To give you an idea, in November 1987, Ed saw and took 5 photographs of this flying saucer over his home in Gulf Breeze. And over the months to May 1988, he photographed it actually about 50 times, including the double shots taken on a three-dimensional thing set up by Bruce Maccabee. He had a lot of shots on a Polaroid camera, which were the initial ones. He took a stereo set of photographs using a 4-lens Nimslow camera, which was sealed by Walt Andrus and the MUFON people. They'd taken a test shot first, and then he had to see if he could take some shots, which he did. It was opened publicly in front of cameras, and the saucer, a saucer, not quite that one, was on it. Every time he got to have a sighting, he was pre-warned by a buzzing in his head, which would tell him the UFO was coming down. That, I think, was odd, because the first instruction he received from them was don't take photographs, and then they warned him when they were coming to get his camera ready. But, you know. On May the 1st, 88, I think it was, the whole thing completely stopped for him, and this was after an abduction where he had a missing time of 1.25 hours. He's had a couple of random sightings. The way he put it was, I was suddenly just an ordinary witness to the occasional sighting since then. Regressive hypnosis, I gather, has showed a series of lifetime contacts. I wasn't able to speak to the person that had conducted the regressive hypnosis, Dan Overlaid, because sadly he had died just before the conference. Gary Watson told me that he, along with the other investigating team, had listened to all the tapes, and all he could tell me was that it was, quote, full of real weird stuff. He won't tell me what it's about. The whole team, by Ed, has been sworn to secrecy, basically until Ed can make some sense of it. He doesn't want anything made public till he can make some sense of it. Well, I think we've seen that in witnesses. I mean, I think that's fair. A lot of witnesses would rather assess something before they start talking to others. For any technical details of the hypnosis, I guess the only person to talk to there is Bud Hopkins. He wasn't, as I understand it, involved in the regressions of Ed, but he has been involved in the regressions of other witnesses there. Certainly no point talking to me. It was one area that I didn't manage to get into. Over time and up to today, and there were 4 sightings in the time that I was there. Unfortunately, I didn't have any of them. But over time and up to today, I think there have been something like 200 witnesses that have joined in with citing photographs, and some of them very similar to Ed. Just have a quick look at a couple of other things. That, again, is just another picture, not one of Ed's pictures of the saucer. The foliage here is brilliantly lit, showing the flash going off here. I cannot tell you anything about the technicalities of these photographs. I've got a couple of comments on Bruce Maccabee in a moment, but I can't tell you what this means. This one, if I remember rightly, yes, is another picture of the same saucer, it would seem, but not taken, apparently, by Ed, taken by another witness. It has to be said that this is very suspicious. There have been 2 people who have taken photographs exactly identical to Ed, and both of them have sent them into the newspapers and remained completely anonymous. And the suspicion has to be that Ed could have been behind that. Other witnesses that have sent things in have sent in things which actually are quite different or more distant. But that one is not one of his. I gather it's not. I borrowed this one from Bud. I gather it's not so-called Believer Bill. It's another woman, and I don't think you knew the name, Bud, did you? No. So, as I say, all I can say is it's very similar, and if it's an independent witness, a genuine one, then really you've got your confirmation. But I can't confirm that at all. This is a picture showing the famous blue beam. And the blue beam is a big thing in this whole incident. In fact, in the conference hall, when you actually go into the conference hall, there's a big blue streamer all the way around the edge, and it says, "Follow the blue beam" to the conference hall. Vicky Lyons said to me, "That's really tacky, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it is." Yeah. The blue beam is a multifunctional device. It apparently can nail your foot to the floor, which is what happened when Ed chased one of their occupants. I'm talking just as if the way Ed talks about it. He chased one of these entities across his the deck, sort of porch. It got away from him because this thing was hovering over his house and fired the beam down and nailed his foot to the floor. On the other hand, he did see the entity run into the beam, and as he himself put it, I've seen Star Trek, but I have to tell what I saw, the entity went straight up the beam. It was a transporter beam, according to Ed. This is the very famous road shot, the one where I first got dirty. The car was parked over here, Ed's pickup truck. This thing was hovering over the road. According to Ed, it fired a white beam at him, not a blue beam, and paralysed the top of his body. And then he managed to crawl underneath the truck to hide. The saucer began spinning round, and each time it made full rotation, it dropped an entity onto the road, till I think there were 5 or 6 entities on the road, all walking towards him with ray guns or, light beam things. Ed, quite prudently, I think, in the circumstances, if all that's true, jumped back in the thing, almost crashed the truck trying to get away, but successfully got away. Another picture of the saucer, which is up there mainly to fill up the numbers because I don't have anything else to put up there. This is the little entity guy, drawn by Ed. I don't know if it's actually drawn by Ed or drawn by someone from Ed's description, but what you're looking at, the shielding, Ed, one night, got the buzz, opened up his curtains, and there was this thing facing him in front, looking in his bedroom windows or sliding French doors. What he could see was the shields. The thing was shielded. And it wasn't until the thing turned and ran away, when Ed started chasing it, that he saw that the shields were not behind, so he got the outline of the figure. So that's drawn in there, but he was seeing that from behind, in effect. Obviously, the face is very classical. I mean, we've seen that face so often from Bud's slides, and we've seen it on the front of the Strieber book. I mean, it's that kind of entity. And as I say, he didn't manage to catch it because the blue beam nailed him to the floor. We'll leave that one up for a second. So, of the impressions that I did glean. The 200 witnesses, for a start. Now, there is an awful lot, as you would expect, there is an awful lot of Me Too stuff. People were telling me things, sort of objects, if you like, or lights that they were seeing, and I had seen them too. I'd been keeping a very close watch. I'd been up all night one night just watching what happens at the, I don't know what the name of it is, but there's a naval air base at Pensacola, a big one. There's a large aircraft carrier in dock at the moment, which I've forgotten the name of, and the Kitty Hawk's coming in, so they're preparing there's a lot of activity. And certainly some of the descriptions, I mean, I'd seen them too. So you're getting Me Too stuff, but that's fine because you expect that. And you always get, in a major case, you get Me Too stuff. The reports, of course, were very, very sincere generally. I suppose there would be some bandwagoning too, but that's okay. I suppose the one thing that does worry me a bit is that as a presentation, MUFON were really counting all 200 witnesses without reminding people that there is a Me Too problem in ufology, and I suppose that's their own kind of excitement to the case. But having said that, I don't think that necessarily means that some of the cases could not be or were not genuine. It would seem they probably are. Secondly, we've got to realise that Gulf Breeze case is a social phenomenon, a real social phenomenon in Gulf Breeze. You are no more likely to find somebody in Gulf Breeze that is prepared to condemn the case than you are to find a virgin in a maternity ward, quite frankly. Some of the witnesses I found were very interesting. I think we have to assume, really, that the quality of the investigating team is such that they should be aware of Me Too problems and bandwagon problems. I assume that they were. You've got to realise this is a pretty high-quality team that was put on it. I'll come on to the team actually in a minute. We should look at the investigation team in a moment. Of the sincerity of the support for the case. Now, this was one thing that did surprise me a bit. I had become very worried on this case that it was a fight, really, between MUFON and principally Willie Smith, who had taken very polarised views about this particular case. And they'd taken those polarised views very early. And I was afraid, really, that now evidence was not going to come to the fore that would ever shake them. They were going to stick by their guns, whatever. And I have to say I didn't get that impression. Talking to the people, the way... We're talking about impressions here, not facts. But the way that they were talking to me, and I've talked to investigators in, loads of countries of the world, and obviously in England, they seem genuinely to believe that A, it's a real case, and B, that they're doing a good job on the case. So I don't think it's just a kind of anti-Willie Smith campaign, and I think that has to be understood, because I think that is a feeling that's been going on in this country anyway, that it might be just a polarised view. I don't think it's as simple as that anyway. Of the team itself, of the validity of the team, they're about the top crew that MUFON could have fielded. Walt himself, part of the team, some pretty hot people. I mean, Charles Flanagan, I can't remember their exact titles, but I think Charles Flanagan's a state director and Don Ware is an area state director or several state director or something of that sort. So we're talking about some fairly top guys. And that brings us to a real problem, because as a researcher, I can't, if I want to make a point or to try to understand a point about this subject, I've got to go to the research, to the investigators' files. They're the sort of frontline troops. They pull in the stories. There's no way that if I need 200 cases, I can personally give this kind of effort to 200 cases. So therefore, you've got to rely on your frontline troops. Now, there has been a lot of dismissal of this case. No matter what the facts may say, I know that this is a fake kind of problem in this country particularly. I don't know if it's a fake, but can you just dismiss the work of a good top investigating team just because you don't like to agree with their conclusions? It is a bit of a problem. I mean, Gulf Breeze does have its problems, and I'll come to those in a moment, but the fact is you've got a good team there. Where are you going to draw the line between having to reinvestigate everything yourself just because you don't like it and accepting the work of your frontline troops? Of the famous model that was found in Ed's house, this one at least we can nail down. Here is one fact that we can give you. And I'm quite satisfied from going through all of the stuff with the investigators and with Ed that was a plant on Ed and it wasn't Ed being caught out. For a start, you must look at the complexity of this case. If Ed's doing this as a fraud, then he has planned this well in advance and done it very well. And it is inconceivable that he would be so stupid as to leave one of the models laying in his house when he'd moved out. The house was empty for 4 months anyway. I should have thought he'd have noticed that he hadn't got it with him. Anyway, that is circumstantial. The fact is that in order to prove that Ed Walters had in fact made the model, they lined the inside of it with scraps of his own architectural paper. He is an architect who designs houses for people, and he does it all on blueprints. And this little bit was inside with his signature on it and one or two facts to show that it was indeed a real Ed Walters blueprint. With the investigating team, I didn't do it personally. I have to rely on Gary Watson, but Gary Watson tells me he went through every stage of this with Ed, discovering with Ed all the way and talking independently to the people involved. Ed was able to actually find what that blueprint was, and that blueprint was created for somebody specifically in September 1989, well after he had photographed all the models on the... photographed all the sources. Yeah, we'll come down here later, but I have a problem with the photographs. But nonetheless, that was definitely planted to discredit him. Now, Ed does not design massive similar housing estates or anything. You go to Ed and you get a particular house designed for you. So eliminate the possibility that they could have got dates wrong or anything else. This blueprint, which I'd seen some bits of with Ed when I was with Ed, the blueprint is quite categorically this one designed for one person, and in fact the person didn't want the house in the end. He bought one that Ed had made somewhere else, so Ed threw the blueprint out. Someone went through his garbage and took it and did this. We'll consider who in a moment. There's a problem with Believer Bill. You've all heard of Believer Bill. I did my damnedest to go around there and try and find Believer Bill. I didn't expect to do in 2 days what they couldn't do in 18 months. The fact is Believer Bill cannot be located. The lady that took the photograph that you saw there is... I got that from Bud just now, so I didn't do anything about her particularly, but I was looking for other people that had sent in those kind of pictures rather than just the other kind of more general kind. Couldn't find any. That is obviously a problem. Of the debunking and the sabotage, that is interesting stuff. There is undoubtedly some debunking going on this case. There is a real polarisation. I don't think Willie Smith is a debunker. In fact, I've got the greatest respect for the way he analyses South American cases. It's very good. I don't know about his UNICAC project. I know that's come into some stick, but that's not my field really anyway. But I do think probably he took a line on this case early on and is, in effect, debunking this case. He is, in effect, staying by his guns. I don't think he has quite the sincerity in his disagreement with the case that the MUFON team have with the support for the case. But behind that, there is, in fact, a problem with two local newspapers. The Gulf Breeze Sentinel is the one which Ed first sent the photographs to and who have continually backed this case all along. And it was a reporter from the other newspaper that was given a tip to go to the house to find the model that would prove Ed was cheating and all the rest of it. And it seems that that paper is taking the we're going to bring this case to pieces because that will make us a big circulation. They're both obviously in it for the circulation. There's no ufology in those two. I mean, they're obviously fighting for what they can get out of it. But I think we've got to remember that that's going on as well. And I think really that the majority of problem is coming from the paper that wants to get in on the act rather than the one that already is. Someone asked me to ask Ed why he had a Polaroid camera. He's a rich man, and all he's got is this cheap little Polaroid camera. That seemed a very valid question because cameras are typically the sort of toys that wealthy-ish people buy. And he gave me an answer which I find perfectly reasonable. He, as I said, he's an architect, he designs work, and he has to go to sites and he has to photograph those things as they're progressing, and he just gets the thing straight out. He can look at it, he knows he's got what he wants, he goes away. He could be lying, naturally, but I think that was a very valid reason why he would have a Polaroid camera. Of Ed himself, I spoke to him for 1.5 hours. Perhaps I should say I only spoke to him for 1.5 hours, so maybe you should bear that in mind. But I came out trusting him quite well. And that, I think, is probably going to be the biggest surprise in this country, because I think a lot of people were just saying, well, this guy just can't be true. It's instinctive, I suppose. As I said, it's all impressions, it's no facts. I treated him as I would treat a witness of my own, and he kind of passed the kind of checks you do to see if you can catch him out in a lie. Someone said, well, he's obviously well rehearsed, he's been at it for a long time. Fair enough, he's well rehearsed and he could have done. But you won't appreciate, when you see Ed, how he really talks, because he has this very slow, modulated, thoughtful, slow, paused tone when he's doing presentations like, say this. But when you talk to him normally, he's speaking at 90 miles an hour all the time. He's the kind of guy who comes into a room, sits down and waits for his briefcase to catch him up. He's very fast. His arms are going all the time. He says one thing, he docks to something else, he comes back to that. Now, again, I can't verify this, but according to Gary Watson, every one of their major interviews with Ed was recorded, and they were specifically analysed for the point of view of checking whether he ever caught himself out in a lie. And there were minor differences, which, again, I think you expect when you're trying to recall something. There were no major faults in the recall. Neither did it contradict at all what Frances Walter said. She's a very prominent witness in this case. She was kept out of it at the beginning, but in fact she's been sort of attacked by the blue beam, and she's seen the thing and photographed it. She's very much in the case. There's no contradiction. Again, you might not like that conclusion, but where are you going to draw the line on dismissing it when the investigators have done what they can do and seem to come up with a good answer? Of the rumours about Ed, I won't go into them in great detail. He's a demonologist. No, he's not. He does play games. I didn't take his word for that. He has these kind of spooky night games with local kids and things. I didn't take his word. I spoke to some people and they said, no, you play around with Ed, but he's demonology. Does he need the money? No, he's not. I'm sure he can use it like the rest of us, but he is wealthy in his own right. I mean, real estate in America, you can imagine. Is he a publicity hog? I thought so, actually. I thought he was really enjoying what he was up to. But I don't know that necessarily counts against him or for him, but I think he was a publicity hog. There's a rumour that he might be running for mayor of Gulf Breeze. You're laughing, but it's true. The fact is that he may well become mayor of Gulf Breeze, and I said, well, it's rather a good spin-off from your case. And he said no, and he showed me again documents going back over years, which in fact he was able to prove. He's been very prominent in the civic life of Gulf Breeze, and it wouldn't be unnatural for a person in his position, sort of wealthy, upper middle class person, to become mayor. So again, I don't think it proves anything one way or the other, but if you hear that rumour, well, that's the background to it. Now, there is a little bit of a problem with Gulf Breeze, and that is the photographs. I just can't believe them. And again, I'm now trapped in the same problem that I've just been talking about, because they've been analysed extensively by Bruce Maccabee, who spent a lot of time on it and who is supposed to be one of the top optical physicists. Now, unfortunately, he's got a bit of a bad name around here for maybe messing up a bit on the Peter Beard case, or at least not being very positive on the Peter Beard case. But am I going to criticise Bruce Maccabee? When I wanted to take a picture of Bruce Maccabee, he had to set my camera so that I could do it properly. I mean, I'm not going to tell him, he doesn't know what he's doing with the photograph. So I can't make any real comment about that, but I do not find the photographs very plausible. There is one real specific problem if you look at that, and I tested this with Ed deliberately, and I think it was with Bard actually, I'm not sure. It might have been with Bard, might have been with Eddie Bullard. But I got Ed when he was aside, and I said, look, I want to get a picture of me and Bud, or whoever it was. Would you mind taking it, Ed? So I gave Ed the camera, and he took the picture. And then I went over to him and I said, Ed, you just put me straight in the middle of that viewfinder. Why, when you saw that, didn't you put it in the middle of the viewfinder? Why did you put it up in the corner? This isn't the best shot to demonstrate that. There is one where it's right up in the corner. In a lot of the shots, it's all over the place. Some of the ones I put up earlier on, actually, are blow-ups from the inside of the thing, and it's not always put in the middle. I think if you would imagine that if you see something like that going past the sky, you would put it into the middle, if you could. He had no real answer. He sort of said, well, it moved, and, the Polaroid's slow. That would seem to suggest to me that you ought to get blur on this as it's moving. Maccabee said no, but in any case, my feeling was that if it moved that quickly, you ought to get blur. None of them are blurred. They're all very clear. So, I have to admit, I just cannot believe the photographs. If you ever look on that TV screen over there, people up there in that quadrant of the room, I think you can just about see an Ed Walters flying saucer. I noticed it when I was sitting up there. That it could be a reflection of light is, not a reflection of light, but a deliberately reflected image into the camera to give the extra focal length that could maybe fool Maccabee. I don't know. As I say, I'm not going to say what Maccabee can and can't do because I couldn't even operate my own camera. The overall impression, I came away with very distinctly trusting the investigating team, and reasonably enough trusting the witness, and totally distrusting the photographs. Now, you will have spotted that is an almost perfect contradiction, and all I can say is that's the way I felt. For what it's worth, when I told that to Jenny Randalls when I came here and she asked me, she sort of looked a little bit taken aback and said, well, I've just got a letter in from Jacques Vallée, and he said exactly the same thing. He trusts the witness and doesn't trust the photographs. I can't reconcile that to you, I'm afraid. You'll just have to take it. There's nothing I can do about it. That's the way I feel. let's play. I've got a couple of minutes. Let's play with some really wacky speculation here. I don't want to start getting quoted on new theories. This is wacky speculation, but it's maybe account for some of the American ufology. And when I put this to them in my talk in America, I suppose they smiled a bit, laughed a bit. Theory. The UFOs, all UFOs, are toys. You give a toy train to a child, not to teach him about toy trains or trains, but to teach him about play and social interaction. But you must be sure to give a child a toy that he can relate to. And maybe the Americans relate to that kind of flying saucer. Send that to some countries in Europe and they'll laugh it out silly. So maybe you send Europeans a different kind of thing, a toy, to take their mind off whatever it is. Maybe it's cornfield circles. Maybe you have to focus on this in order that something else happens back here. I don't know. As for who are they, God knows. I was interested, well, maybe he does. I was interested, Elsie said, that Jenny might have been influenced to put something in the story of Elsie's own encounter, which actually was completely wrong. Jenny was wrong to put it in. But then Elsie said, well, nonetheless, it made me think. And she then said, well, maybe Jenny was kind of under this influence. That's not the first case I've heard of where the investigators seem to actually become truly involved in the situation. So perhaps this bitter conflict in the States between these two is a kind of necessary part of the learning process of whatever this is. And perhaps, as ufologists, we're going to have to open up our minds a little bit to the possibility that the investigators are not out on the outside so much, looking in, and maybe they're on the inside. See what happens in the future. There's a possibility that the photos are completely faked and that Ed Walters is completely lying, and that he doesn't know that he's doing it under external influence from there somewhere. There's a thought. I mean, the fact is that it all goes to emphasise the total absurdity factor of UFOs. And it's a factor so strong, and Bud's often talked about this absurdity factor. He talked about it yesterday. They do one thing one time and they do something completely different the next time in the same circumstances. Maybe instead of rejecting it or being exasperated by it, maybe we've actually got to study it as a specific point, the absurdity factor in UFOs. I'll close by offering a solution offered to me in a breakfast meeting with Jacques Vallée. He explained the whole phenomenon, and I'm pretty sure he's probably got it right. There are two races up there, and they're having a competition. And the competition is to see which one can get the most UFO books written about their race. Thank you.
Thank you very much for volunteering, John. We're going to hold the questions on that. What I would say is that if anyone wants to read more about this very controversial case, I'm sure you've seen the book out there in the foyer. We're going to move speedy along because we are a little bit pushed for time. And I'm stalling while our next speaker gets mic'd up. But I'll start the introduction. Again, for those who weren't with us yesterday, if one gentleman has been responsible for bringing UFO abductions to the forefront, certainly over this last decade, and a little bit beyond that, then it is our next speaker. He is well known throughout the UFO community. They say there are quite a number of you in the audience today who have read his books, the first one of which was Missing Time, and the second is Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is our microphone working here? I guess it is. First of all, we're going to make this, of course, brief so we can have more time for questions. And I would like to say, first of all, how warmly you have received me and how much I appreciate that. It has been really a wonderful treat to be here. And I think I can identify with John Spencer, who felt that he was going to be needing a flak jacket when he got to America. And of course, people told me, when you get here, they're going to rip you up. You know, you're going to be in a terrible state. Well, what I found out after, for instance, a very interesting dinner conversation last night with Paul Devereux, amongst others, is that our area of disagreement is much, much smaller than anybody imagines. We perhaps look at this slightly differently. I think we have essentially different areas of the phenomenon that we have investigated. I think that, of course, the Earthlight phenomenon was fascinating in its the way it was explained, discussed this afternoon. What Jenny had to say was extremely interesting to me. I don't think we have any serious disagreements whatsoever. We picked this up perhaps by different ends of it. I have no theoretical motor going in me to come up with theories all the time. I'm very trusting of my fellow human beings. I'm trusting of what they tell me, when I can check it out to some extent. I'm trusting of the psychiatrists, psychologists, gynecologists, medical people of all sorts who have been helping me in these investigations. And we put the pieces together, and we never know where we're going until more data assembles, and we suddenly find we have another slight direction, something new that we've learned. And I think I can say, without embarrassment, that from my first research and then finally the book, Missing Time, came out in 81, which was, I began it, I believe, in 77. With my first abduction cases I was working on were 76. And at that point we only had a handful, 4 or 5 that any of us really knew about. To my new book, Intruders, and things I've learned since then, that I feel with a sigh of relief that I don't have to go back and apologize for anything I've said or take anything back and say, boy, I really jumped the gun here or I made a mistake. I think that actually the data that's emerged has held together. And I think that somehow or other, the line from the original Betty Barney Hill case, as it was written in still what may be the most important book yet in the field, which was Interrupted Journey by John Fuller, Fuller doesn't have to apologize for anything he said either. It has borne itself out as we've moved along, and I think that's really quite fascinating, quite important. We haven't had to backtrack. Over and over again, we find new directions in what we're doing that merely confirm what were little foundations before. One of two things had to happen years ago. This thing had to either just totally collapse of its own craziness, its own absurdity, or somehow or other it had to keep fitting together. Things had to keep building block upon block, or they were going to disintegrate. Well, they have not disintegrated. We have more and more evidence, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. I'd like to make a little addendum on the Gulf Breeze case, though, just very quickly, if I can have the first slide, and the lights. First of all, something that John neglected to mention, should have been mentioned. These photographs were versions of photographs taken from Polaroids, which were then diddled with in various ways to bring out some kind of detail, which then had slides made from them. This is probably about a 5th or 6th generation awful slide. All of the slides that you saw that John was showing were really pretty terrible. When you see the Polaroids, and incidentally in the Gulf Breeze book, many of them, the Polaroids are reproduced, but again, that's a 3rd generation thing you're looking at. When you see the actual picture and hold it in your hand, it looks like a thing up there in the sky. These things look very, very peculiar indeed. And that's one of the problems. There's a very amusing thing, a typical Bruce Maccabee observation. He has a lot of wit and humor, and I'm the one that dragged him into this. I got involved in the case very early on, and of course I accept the truthfulness of Ed, his wife, his little daughter, who I interviewed, and I've written in my introduction to the Gulf Breeze book a lot about the family themselves. Nobody but a monster could train a 13-year-old girl to lie with emotion according to a script. Ed is no monster. A monster cannot pass lie detector tests, voice stress analysis tests, psychological evaluation, and 20 years of marriage, she would know, and all kinds of friendships, and still retain a sociopathic personality. It just seems to me totally impossible. The interesting thing about this unbelievably complex story is that Ed will say, yes, on the 13th, that's when I went to such and such. I said, but didn't you on the 14th? No, the 14th was when I went to the back, and he has it all memorized. And I quoted one of the best lines ever that Mark Twain ever wrote. And he said, always telling the truth means never having to remember anything. Only the liar has to keep it straight in his mind. No liar would have invented such a complex tale as Ed did. But at any rate, in the background of these poor photographs, Bruce Maccabee, the poor copies, in that road shot, which I don't have here, the reflection or light shining down the ground, we don't know what the heck it is actually, is not circular. It has a sort of straight line quality and almost triangular. And one of the debunkers said, aha, you see, it can't have been a real photograph because it's not an exact circle down on the ground. And Bruce said, of course, if you had a light in a model, you would get a circle on the ground, or if you had some kind of a fake thing, that's what you would do. But he said, unfortunately, that's not the way it looks. And he said, unfortunately, we don't know the pattern of the light inside the craft. And if we did, he said, then it might be circular, it might be triangular, it might be anything. We have no way of knowing. In other words, a hoaxer would have had to go to a great extent just to fix up something that is not what we would expect. Anyway, this is a little photograph taken. This is the Believer Bill photograph, one of them. This is extremely grainy, and this is again a slide taken from a photograph. This is the one of the craft. This is another one tilted back at an angle. They were not in plane with one another, which is very interesting. If you imagine this rim of light, and you can see sort of up in the bottom of that, there they are close by, but hanging in different planes. This, incidentally, is the drawing that I referred to yesterday of a case from 1960, which occurred on Long Island. The woman was abducted, described going up through the bottom, a rim of lights. There was a lens-like opening at the bottom, etc. And it's, of course, astonishingly like the Ed Walters photographs. So we do have a precedent. We have many other drawings and illustrations which are like this too. We do have a pattern here, although it's unusual. Anyway, this is a photograph I was sent by somebody. He sent me actually not the photograph, but a negative. And he took this in a city, Montgomery, Alabama, which is not a world away from Gulf Breeze, last spring. And he had not developed it. He sent me one. He sent one to Walt Anderson, and I guess that was it. But anyway, what this shows are lights down the ground of street lights or whatnot, and then there are cars and trucks parked. It was a truck stop he pulled off, very nervous, to take the picture that he was interested in. And what we're looking at, essentially, is up at the top. There is a horseshoe shape of little lights with a dot behind it, which he said was moving very slowly. Trucks were stopping and looking at it. When you blow it up, this is what you get. Now, what's extremely interesting is that it's hard to see in this slide, but that each one of those appears to be virtually a complete ring when you examine the photograph. But again, they don't seem quite in plane with one another. It's as if some are seen from a steeper angle and some more parallel to the ground, etc. But it's a very interesting kind of analogy. We do have, in other words, a range of this sort of situation, the open circle bottom craft flying around in areas near Gulf Breeze at the time. This is one of Ed's early drawings of a figure he remembered with a hooded thing around it. Ed is a very gentle man as a personality, and he gave this a rather sweet disposition, I think. This is not a female, apparently, and it's not hair, this is a hood. And when you look at another one from another case that I have from Mexico, this is the hooded figure again, and it bears an interesting kind of connection with Ed's, the shape of the eyes and the face. The interesting thing here, too, is that the man who made this drawing is essentially someone who has enormous love and feeling of loneliness for the aliens. He has this tremendous desire to be with them, even though apparently that's what they look like. It's a little hard to explain this. But I think that when we talk about these experiences, and over again, you're struck by the complexity of emotion, the sense of dread that people will have, the sense of absolute awe and wonder. They're in this thing, and it's magic, and it's just unbelievable. Also the terror, the absolute fear. And then there's the anger, the sense of being used and abused without permission having been granted. It's a range of emotions, many of which would seem contradictory. And one man put it very, very succinctly. He said, "Bud, sometimes I go to bed at night, and just before I go to bed, I go to the window, and I think, I want to see them again. I want them to come. I want to see them and be with them. I just have this longing." And then I go to bed, and in the middle of the night, I wake up. My wife wakes me up because I'm screaming in terror, and she shakes me awake with having a nightmare about it. And I think that kind of states the problem. If we can, I think that's it on the slides. If we can have the lights again. Now, one of the things that's an essential philosophical point to make, that is that we're all, regardless of our points of view, and the particular areas that interest us, we're all very aware we're facing a gigantic phenomenon, a gigantic mystery. We want this mystery to resolve itself. We have a tendency to want to write a book that says the mystery solved, everything's figured out, finally resolved, whatever. We want to get a little hunk of it and be able to nail it down and say, that's it. This is just a natural human need to get a kind of intellectual rope around this thing, tie it up. And of course it has resisted that kind of being tied up all along. I think that has to be remembered when we have these, let's say, mock skirmishes about how we interpret various pieces of this particular puzzle. That we're all operating from a desire to get it figured out and ended and settled once and for all. But beyond that is another thing that is extremely important, and that is that at the very deepest level, this is profoundly upsetting to each and every one of us. We would not be here if it didn't bother us in some way or other. We wouldn't be thinking about this. We wouldn't be sitting here spending all this time unless somehow this has gotten to us in some odd way. It does have us by the throat. It is upsetting. It is something that has a kind of subterranean dread that goes right along with it. And there's an interesting story about a woman who was a UFO researcher, and her neighbors laughed at her, etc., and she read the debunking attacks and so on. But one day, her son, a teenager, played a trick on her, and I would have grounded him, as we say, for about 3.5 years if he had done this to me. He came rushing into the kitchen and he said, Mother, they just interrupted television. UFOs are landing in all the major capitals of the world. There's an emergency meeting at the UN that's just been called. The president's going to be on the air in a half an hour. And she said chills were going up and down her body. There wasn't anything like, you see, I was right, or that'll fix the man whose name I don't pronounce, or anything like that, or you see, I was right. She said sheer panic. And then, of course, when she found out, I don't know what happened to the boy, but his food was a little thin for weeks, I guess. But the basic point is, she wasn't aware of how much this was upsetting her, this whole subject, that she was drawn to like the moth to the flame. Now, I have a personal theory that the better the evidence, the more upsetting the evidence. I mentioned yesterday that when people have a kind of confirmatory piece of evidence fall in their laps, like I mentioned the woman who, when she saw a set of symbols identical to the one she had drawn, someone else had drawn, she burst into tears. It was as if she could not handle that degree of confirmation. And I think that one of the basic problems with Gulf Breeze is the photographs are, as somebody said, too good. They may be real. If those things are real, then we're in some kind of a trouble because these things are flying around. They're real things. It has a strange sense of upsetting us because we are much more comfortable with a blurry photograph of something shooting by which is covered with orange or something and we don't know what the heck we're looking at. That's okay. That's kind of out there. But I think right now we're looking at stuff that is too close. And I want to make a point. I'm going to go into another case, but I just want to make to me, a very important point. We now have 3 objects which may be implants that have been retrieved. We don't know yet. They're under examination, 2 of them in very top-level scientific hands. One of the men, as a matter of fact, I have to use an assumed name when I call him because of his situation, his use of the electron microscope and other things where he is in residence. We won't go into it. Okay, we may have actually something that every single scientist in the world might have to say, okay, this is not of this planet, I don't know what this thing is, but we have to agree now that there is absolutely something out there. I was on a panel, John was on it, we were talking at the conference in Pensacola last week, and they were talking about government cover-up, and I said, wait a second, what about our having to possibly cover something up? What is our responsibility? Those of us who have been UFO researchers for years, what do we do if, God forbid, we have something that is irrefutable proof? In conjunction with everything else, photographic evidence, the radar evidence, the ground traces, every other thing that we've been looking at that I showed yesterday and so forth. What if we have it? What do we do? Absolutely, what do we do? Do we call a press conference? Do we call the president? Do we... whatever. We have never had, because we don't want this to be real, really real. We want it to be out there somewhere. We have never had a contingency plan. None of us have ever sat down around the table and said, what is our responsibility? If we had, God forbid, to make the biggest, most important announcement ever made in the history of the world, and I don't think that's too extreme a statement to make, if it's true. And I'm not saying we have this kind of evidence, but we have absolutely no plan, no idea about what is required of us, no sense of clear responsibility. We're not going to smack our lips and say, you see, we were right. That's not it. We might find ourselves in a position of a government cover-up that's a civilian cover-up. I don't know. I'm only throwing this out to say the evidence may be here very, very soon. It may be. It may not be, but it may be. We may even have it. And then what is our responsibility? And I think every one of us who's a serious researcher has got to, in our own imagination, his or her imagination, have a contingency plan that we're thinking about. Otherwise, I think we're being extremely irresponsible. Now, one of the things about this issue of not wanting to believe it, not wanting to accept it, I mentioned yesterday, and it's absolutely true, most people have a terrible time handling this. I'm talking at this point with people who've had abduction experiences. They don't really want this to be true because it is so damned unbelievable. And at the beginning of my book, of course, I use the example in the introduction of the fact that the human mind shuts down, as it were, when it gets to have to entertain certain kinds of things as really real. For instance, thinking about one's own death. That's just, in the abstract, we can handle it, but otherwise it's pretty hard to do. I mentioned my example in the introduction, which I call the Frankfurter Effect, when Felix Frankfurter was being informed about the details of the Holocaust as it was unfolding in Poland in the first years of the 40s by an eyewitness, Jan Karski, and when he heard this enormous tale of horror, he turned to Jan Karski and said, I don't believe you. And Karski said, but I was a witness. I saw it with my own eyes. I'm telling the truth. And Frankfurter said, it's not that you're not telling the truth, it's that I can't believe you. He said, there's a difference. Now, this material is of that nature. Our mind wants to say, no, it must be this, it must be that. And when Jenny talked about the fact that 95% of our cases are identified, I used the figure 90% in Missing Time that I wrote many years ago. We don't even at this point seriously think about nightlight sightings as being worth looking into. I haven't thought of that for years and years. We're talking about that other residual percentage, which has a tremendous kind of evidential weight behind it. We look into it, we don't like to think of it as being real. The abductees themselves are in even a worse spot. If it's real, they're really in some trouble because it may be happening to their children. It may have happened to them in situations that they're not consciously remembering. And I will just give an example. A man who was driving home, his name is Joe, a wonderful guy, he's a technician when it comes to electronics. He was driving home on Long Island in the 70s, which is when I first looked into this. He came up a little hill where the road was somewhat sheltered from other cars, and a ball of light came shooting right at the car. The very next thing he knew, again, that seamless joining of time, he is no longer in his car. He's on his hands and knees alongside the road. He's not anywhere near where this had happened. He's something like 5 miles away on a little side road. There's no car. His car is gone. Now he stood up, extremely confused, and realized certain things as he began to look around in a dazed state, that he felt strangely nauseous. He realized that his shirt was unbuttoned and had been unbuttoned and buttoned wrong. It was off one. His belt buckle was unbuckled and hanging. His socks, as he later found out, were not on his feet, but they were folded up neatly and they were in his pocket. He had also, as we used to say as children, had an accident in his pants. He didn't tell me that at the time. That came out later, a couple of years later, when he could get over the humiliation. He had no idea where he was, what was happening. He also had a wristwatch and coins in his pocket, and the wristwatch was almost hot. The coins in his pocket were almost hot. He looked around, could not see his car, and he staggered down the road to as he was walking along the road, somebody pulled up and said, are you okay? Good Samaritan, have you been hurt? Because actually the driver thought he'd been hit by a car. So he said he had to get to a telephone. So the man drove him just a very short distance, a few hundred yards. There was a place along the way, a little grill or luncheonette or something. And he went in. This was after dark. Of course, there's a time lapse involved, too. And he realized he couldn't think of his own phone number. He couldn't think of anything. He sat down. He ordered a drink. Tried to think of who we should be calling. Tried to think of his home phone. Finally got it and remembered it. And when he felt a little better, he made a phone call. And he found out from the man behind the bar or the counter where he was, which is 5 miles or so from where the light came in his car. His wife came out with a friend, and they were driving another car, so, he could be, in case the two of them came in one car, so one of them could drive his car home if there was a problem, because he told his wife he was sick, he didn't know what had happened to him. But as he sat there, he began to remember what had happened. He had this sudden shock of remembering the car surrounded by light, him crouching on the floor and trying to climb under the dashboard of the car on the right side, and seeing two little men on the left window and one on the right, and one was kind of leaning over the windshield. He had locked the doors, the windows were down a little bit, and he remembered these long gray fingers going over the window and then pushing it down. And then he remembered being taken out, being in absolute terror, but he couldn't move. Walked along, and it's a very interesting feature, and I have run into this in other cases. The two of them were walking in front of him, and he was walking behind them towards, evidently, a craft. And every time he would stop and think, because he had very little will or energy, he was going to stop and try to escape, this wave of nausea would hit him in the stomach. And then he would start to walk again, and the nausea would disappear, as if something is being played in from the outside and affecting those nerve centers that create that kind of reaction. At any rate, he was on a table, he remembered the whole episode and so forth. And this has nothing to do with hypnosis. This is all a recollection without hypnosis. But at any rate, it was an extremely horrifying thing. And it also, in retrospect, triggered some similar memories from when he was a child. But I remember this, that's the point of this story. When I he came to see me, and we had to move his car from one parking place to another. And I remember getting in the car on the passenger side, the wrong side for you people here. You have a strange way of doing these things. At any rate, he opened the door. I opened the door on my side, and I naturally found myself staring at the dashboard, thinking, always checking, is a room under there for somebody? Can you actually get down there and climb under? It was a big old Chevrolet, and there was plenty of room. And as he got in the driver's side, he looked over, he sort of saw where I was looking, and he said, "Yeah, Bud, this is the car." And I said, "Well, I guess you were down there." He said, "I was crouched under there, scared to death." And he sat down, and then he looked at me, and I have never seen such a kind of pleading look in his eye, and he said, "Bud, did this really happen to me?" Now, this is a man there's no hypnosis, there's no reading books or anything like this. This is a man who had this experience. And of course I said, "Joe, and I don't, I can't be in your head. I can't really know what the story is." But the point is that even a man who remembers everything normally, totally naturally, is pleading with me to tell him it didn't happen. He imagined it. Or something, anything. The point is that this is intolerable material. These are intolerable experiences. We want them to go away. We don't like evidence. We don't like the idea of this actually happening to people and children being taken, etc., etc. It's extremely difficult. Now, to get to another point here about the use of hypnosis, and of course I know hypnosis has become the whipping boy of all of this, and I can assure you it shouldn't be seen that way, but of course it can be misused like any other thing can be misused. Hypnosis has a kind of wonderful side effect in that it releases tension, it ventilates the experience. I've now worked with probably 300 people over the years, not necessarily me doing hypnosis, but abductees who, many of those 300, probably 250 of them have had some hypnosis done by various psychiatrists, psychologists, and skeptics and whatnot. But I think in every single case I've ever seen, there's been an enormous kind of release. The first thing that everybody realizes is Thank God I'm not crazy. This suddenly, a lot of things make sense that hadn't made sense before. And I mentioned in a paper I wrote earlier what I called the skeleton key effect, and I alluded to it yesterday, whereby somebody who has a weird phobia that they don't understand, which may conceivably, in some cases, be connected with their UFO recollections, they will have that phobia removed, in a sense, through getting at what the real problem was. And I'll just give you one example. There's a police officer, very tough guy, detective, works undercover. His nose goes about 3 different ways because he's been in a lot of fights, he said. But he's a very nice guy and, in a way, very gentle. The way he began to look into his problems were he had always lived with a particular UFO sighting which had bothered him. He was 22 years old or 21. He was out at a shooting range by himself out in the country, and as he's bringing his pistol down to fire at some tin cans or something, there's a flash of light, like a mirror reflecting, and he said he looked around, and at about the height of the telephone pole, right behind him, was this very large craft, 40 feet or so in diameter. And he's looking at it in absolute amazement. And the very next instant, again, no sense of a break in time, he's not where he was standing. He's about 20 feet away, and his hand is at his side, and he has his back turned. And there's a sudden confusion. How did I get over here? And he looked around. Of course, the thing wasn't there, and it was a time lapse. This man later began to... This always bothered him, as had other things. He decided really he had to look into it when one day he was watching a television program, and there was there were a couple of women from the Casey County, Kentucky case being interviewed. And they were telling about what had happened in their abduction experience. And he's just watching this. And he said that he found himself absolutely bathed in tears. Just tears are running down his face. Unbelievable sobbing. He thought, what is this? What is this? Where is this coming from? And a friend of mine who has been through this said to him, talking to him later, she said, when was the last time you cried like that, or cried in the real world? And he said, well, I had a friend who was shot, and I shed some tears then. And she said, did you cry when he was killed like this time? And he said, absolutely not. This was completely different. It was just total. She said, did you cry when the Challenger blew up? He said, no, I was sad, but I didn't cry. And a couple of other things like that. And then she said, well, what does that tell you? And, of course, what it told him was there was this gigantic reservoir of feeling that he could not figure out the cause. I think we all have to know when we have this kind of enormous feeling that just wells up in us, that there is somewhere a cause for it. It doesn't come out of the blue, not because we dream something. At any rate, we were talking about phobias and seers, and I said, do you have anything? This is a routine question I asked somewhere along in the investigation. He said, I have a terrible dread of black widow spiders and spiders. It is just the worst fear anybody ever saw. But he said, I know how I got the fear. I know what caused it. So I said, what was that? He said, well, when I was a little boy, I was about 5 years old, I remember it very vividly. I was in my bed, which was right by the window. And in the middle of the night, I looked over, and there were these black widow spiders and a spider's nest, a white spider's nest, in the corner of the window. And he said, I was so scared, I didn't know what to do. And he said, I think I hid under the covers. I don't even know what I did. But he said, in the morning, when I woke up, I screamed for my mother. I wouldn't get out of bed till she came in. And she had to point out that there are no spiders in the window. What are you talking about? He said there wasn't anything. And then she explained black widow spiders only build their nests in dark places, under porches and things like that. So he said he began, at the age of 5 or whenever this was, looking for black widow spiders because he hated them and because he was afraid of them. And he would take rocks to catch them and smash them, or he would try to drop them into jars and just stare at them. He was just drawn to them with hatred and fear. So as he told me this, I said, well, I don't understand one thing about this white spider's nest. I said, I'm thinking of a web that's very, open, hardly white. He said, no, this is white. And I said, well, I don't understand also, isn't there one spider per nest? He said, no, in this one there were 2. He said, they were real black and shiny, and they were just together just like this. And when he went like that, he said, oh my God, Well, we looked into the experience, and of course, the little white spider's nest, you can guess what that was in the corner, and this was a childhood abduction. He called me recently, and he said, Bud, I got to thank you. He said, I was combing my hair the other day in front of the mirror, and he said, I looked down, there was a little green spider running across my shirt. And he said, I took my finger and just flicked it off after I finished combing my hair. And he said, 2 years ago I would have probably put my head through the mirror and I probably would have torn my shirt off and ripped myself up. And he said, I just flicked it off when I was finished with it. He said, I have no fear at all of spiders. Now, I mean, over and over again, that kind of thing, understanding what did happen through the process of hypnosis has an undeniable therapeutic effect. The situation of the level to which people have been brought by these fears is really incredible. One woman I've worked with, and for those of you who were here yesterday, I showed photographs of her little boy's drawing. The little boy who said, "Why don't you love me anymore, Mommy?" Because she was frozen and couldn't move during the time he was being taken out of the craft. When I met her, and she wrote to me, typical thing, she got a copy of my book, she read through page 14, and that was it for the next year and a half. She never read anything else, as I told her not to. We automatically tell people not to read anything. But she read the book, and it was something about something up the nose, possibility of an implant or whatever, as people recall, a needle going. Well, that just set her off because she said when she was a young girl, she's now in her middle 40s, she had noticed in the mirror that she had a funny bump on the side of her nose, as if the cartilage was slightly odd, and it bothered her, and it was quite noticeable, and nobody in the family had noticed it before. So she went to a doctor, and he looked up her nose and said, "What kind of operation did you have up there? You had some kind of surgery." And she said, "I've never had any surgery." And the doctor said, "You have a scar, and it's a straight scalpel cut right at that point." And he actually argued with her. He said, you should find out from your mother you had surgery. Well, anyway, it was extremely upsetting, and that was one of the triggering things in conjunction with a lot of other half memories. But at any rate, when this woman, when I first met her and she came to me, she had never slept at night for perhaps 15 years. She would stay up all night, get the kids ready for school and her husband to work, and then she would sleep in the morning. Until the sun came up, it was impossible for her to sleep. She was filled with absolute terror. She had not been able to sleep in her bedroom. She slept on a folding bed that they had in the living room because of some vague memories about something coming through the window in the bedroom. And at any rate, when we looked into it, typical abduction cases, very sad and complex. And again, about a year ago, she called me just so full of happiness on the phone. She said, "But I have a job." She said, "It's only part-time because I can still sleep only half of the night, but I can sleep half of the night." And now she's got herself up to a full-time job, and she's so happy she can hardly stand it. The point is that when we use hypnosis, and we do explore these situations, and the truth does emerge, seems to be the truth, if it's the truth, it's going to somehow have ventilated the situation and helped the person. If it's not the truth, it's probably just going to add more confusion to a life that's already dense and difficult. And my experience with virtually everybody has been that this has been an enormously relieving factor. One more example. A woman who was a young and attractive woman, she's an actress, told me that all her life she'd had this enormous horror of babies. Of course, I naturally asked a lot of questions about, had she had an unhappy pregnancy or some difficult abortion or something personal, and she said, no, that had never happened. She insisted she didn't know what it was. She just dreaded babies. And at one point, she'd had some unpleasant dreams about babies, she said, but that seemed to be part of the problem. In the dream, she was being made to hold something that had a very strange look to it, and it had, rather than legs, it had appendages that blended into a kind of tail-like thing. It was as if it was malformed, and this was a recurring dream. It was a little vague in the dreams, but at any rate, she told me that the worst moment of her baby phobia, and I've run into this in other cases, she said came when she was in a line at a post office to get stamps. And she said that there was a little baby behind her with the parent and a little buggy or something, or whatever, stroller. And the other people in line were saying wonderful things. "Oh, it's a lovely baby, how cute," and "kitschy, kitschy, coo," and all the things you say to babies. And she was getting more and more nervous and frightened and angry. She didn't know what these emotions were. And finally, it got to such a point, she whirled around and she said, "Get that goddamn baby out of here. Stop this. Get it out of here. I can't stand it." Now, this is this attractive young woman. You have to say this is a pretty outrageous thing to say. When she got up to the counter to get her stamps, everybody was staring at her, and the woman behind the counter said, "Can I get you something, aspirin, something to calm you down?" And she was in tears, of course, at this point, and tears of shame. Well, under hypnosis, out came something related to these dream images, and been all kinds of other things happen. What was extremely interesting is that one of her first abduction experiences, she remembered it occurred in New Zealand, and when we went back to it, she was a little girl. She slipped directly into a very thick New Zealand accent, which was kind of touching and a little difficult for me to understand. But again, the pressure it's almost as if you open the safety valve on the problem. And out comes something which is relaxing and by comparison, and one feels better. The problem is that one never feels whole. These experiences are always dangling over you. There's always a terrible problem, and one of the reasons psychologically to handle this, one of the reasons I've set up our network, our Intruders Foundation, which has been mentioned, and anybody who would like to subscribe to our newsletter, I would certainly appreciate it, because in a sense, the money from this is going to try to expand our network of therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, medical people, etc. in the United States and Canada. And we have quite a really efficient network, which has been enormously helpful to people. And incidentally, I should also add, in running support groups, just getting people together who have never really met before to sit down and look around a room full of people who have been through the same crazy, absurd business they've been through. And yet they all look like they've survived nicely. They're healthy, intelligent-looking people, attractive people. When I go an extra week without having a support group meeting, we have them about every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, I get phone calls. People are hungry to be with one another again. They say it's like being with family. Now, we don't sit around and talk about, the aliens I saw were this big and they had a little belt here, and we don't get into that. Actually, we get into having fun, having some wine, having some coffee, soft drinks. It's a party. It's a party atmosphere. We get around to some serious talk at some point. And again, it's not about quote-unquote aliens. We don't know much about aliens. We know a lot about ourselves. And I use the word alien again. As I mentioned before, I used to say it all the time. I use the word in a non-pejorative sense. I mean aliens in the sense that I am an alien in England. If any of you were in the United States, you would be aliens, etc. It means that it says what somebody isn't. Well, anyway, whoever or whatever they are. We don't talk about them much. We talk about ourselves. And people talk about how you go about handling this with your children. How do you go about telling somebody's going with somebody, it's a new relationship, when do I break it to my boyfriend that I may have been through this stuff? Some practical problems like that. There's a lot of joking and fooling around. One person once said, if there's any justice in this universe, somewhere out there in some other solar system, on some other planet, there's somebody abducting those little gray guys, which would be a kind of a nice turnaround. But getting together, talking over our situation, just being friends. Some of the people have referred to these support group meetings as being with family. They're not being quizzed. There's no investigator breathing down their neck wanting to know how high the doorway was to the opening. We don't do that. Our emphasis is on the mental health and stability and friendship that we can all share and grow into. One hopes. There's almost always a therapist there, but we don't try to do this as if it were group therapy. Now, these are just some of the issues I'd like to mention. People have asked me about how Debbie Tomey is getting along. She is Kathy Davis from my book. Her children are talking. The one that had trouble with speech has gone to a special school and is doing very, very well. Debbie has remarried. The marriage is extremely good. They have their own little house. Things are going along very nicely for them, but they're still having problems with whatever it is up there. As an example, Debbie and her 2 sons and her husband, all 4, have had very serious operations up in the upper regions of the nose, the sinuses, and so forth, because of strange scar tissue and blocking and everything else. Unusual that 4 people out of a family of 4 would have to have these operations. and they got themselves in some serious financial problems trying to pay for this. They've had other incidents occur, but again, Debbie is a happy woman in charge of her life with a new husband and feeling very, very good as a result of having partly decided to explore these bottled up fears and problems that she had been going through. Now, at this point, I think that I'd like to let you all have a chance. I'd like to end it here, and if we can have questions, we have a little bit of time, and John has not had any questions. I thought he did an excellent and fair-minded job on Gulf Breeze. Let me tell you one thing about the lie detector test on the Gulf Breeze thing, which is just interesting. Ed Walters told me, he referred to the lie detector, the polygraph man, as the Nazi. The man did not want to give him a polygraph test because he did not believe these photographs could be real. And Ed said that that's a terrible thing, I'm willing to pay you. The man finally agreed, but made him pay in advance. Then Ed said, the man sat him down before they wired him up. And this is a polygraph test. This is a tough guy. He said, I want you to tell me the truth, Ed. Have you ever been in jail? Have you ever lied to your wife on a major issue in the past year? Have you ever lied to a business associate in the past year? On and on and on. I mean, which of us would want to be sitting in a chair like that, answering questions like that? They're very probing and very disturbing. And Ed resolved to tell the truth. So ultimately the guy said, okay, I'll wire you up. Pay in advance. Ed handed out cash. The man then wired him up and went through these same questions about his intimate affairs. Then he said, and this is the way, everybody says it's so easy to pass a lie detector test. A polygraph test is a way of just measuring reaction. So that's all it does. As somebody said, it measures nervousness, not truth. So what they did with Ed is they gave him pieces of paper with numbers 1 to 10, told him to pick one of them, draw a circle around it, and then put them all face down. And then he was told to answer no when the polygraph operator asked him, did you pick one, did you pick two, etc. Now this is an issue which has no emotion connected with it. Who cares? How would Ed care whether he picked 1 or 6 or 9 or something? But he has to lie. And every time he got a reaction at the correct thing. In other words, he showed when he lied that the needles jumped around. The man asked him more questions, went back, recalibrated everything, had him do this number thing again. Each time again, getting a reaction, a difference when Ed lied on the simple issue of what number he picked. The man did the entire test on the photographs. Did you fake this? Are you lying? Did you make this up? Is this a hoax? Etc., etc. And ended it and unhooked Ed, and this was something like, I think he said 3 to 4 hours, the whole thing. And Ed said, well, how'd I do? And the guy said, you'll have to come back. And Ed said, yeah, I have to come back. He said, yes, I have to do this again. The point was, as it turned out, that he had passed the test. And this man could not believe, like many of us and John, that those are real photographs. This could really be, this thing was really flying around out there, captured on film. He did the whole thing again. Ed came back and went through the whole business and passed it. It's a very interesting thing. And people will glibly say, oh, anybody can pass a polygraph. But you can flunk when you're telling the truth, but passing it when you're lying is very difficult. Anyway, that's a statement on air. Why don't we take some questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say, I'm going to invite John onto the stage because we didn't have any time for questions in John's presentation. John would like to join us. We have some 15 minutes for questions. Before we start that, if anyone would like some more of what you've just been hearing, Bud will be speaking in London on the 17th, it's Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, and that will be at the London Business School, Sussex Place, Outer Circle, Regent's Park. I've got the address right, Mike?
Yeah.
Good, I'm not sure for that. So it's much to the same, but Bud will be there, and I'm sure he'll be glad to see you. Again, first come, first go with the questions.
I'm curious to know how these people discovered these implants and how they were actually removed.
Well, we have a number of situations, one of which the implant apparently fell out. The man sneezed, and amongst other things, there was this little object. In another case, well, I won't even say where this implant was. The man could feel it under the skin, and it was not in the head region. It worked its way out of the skin, from under the skin, slowly, and finally came out. And each one of these implants has been cut in half. They're apparently not metallic. Now, I say implants. I don't know what they are. As I said, maybe one of the kids left a